The rain hit the cracked pavement in slow, heavy drops, each one echoing the weight of the moment. A cold wind howled through the empty streets, yet inside the towering apartment complex, there was no warmth, only the sound of heavy boots stomping against the tiled floor. A man stood at the entrance of a dimly lit apartment, his expensive coat barely touched by the storm outside. He watched as the woman in front of him trembled, her hands gripping the last suitcase she could carry. Her voice cracked with desperation. "Please, just a few more days." The landlord smirked, checking the expensive watch on his wrist. "You had days. You had weeks. And now, your time is up." Behind the woman, a young child peeked out, eyes wide, clutching a worn-out stuffed toy. The woman's husband stood silently, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. But he didn't argue, he knew it was useless. The landlord enjoyed this. He enjoyed the control, the power, the finality of it. "You should have paid your rent," he said coldly, waving to the security guards. Within moments, the family was being shoved out. The rain soaked their clothes as they stumbled onto the street. The child sobbed, burying his face in his mother's shoulder. The father kept his eyes locked on the landlord, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, the family turned and walked away. The landlord sighed, shutting the door behind him. Another problem solved. Another worthless tenant gone. He barely remembered their faces as he returned to his warm, luxurious penthouse, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. To him, they were just numbers, just business. But as he sipped his drink, staring out at the city skyline, he had no idea that something had changed. Outside, in the pouring rain, the family stopped at the edge of the street. The father turned back, watching the towering building. His expression was no longer blank, it was something else. Something unreadable. Something the landlord should have feared. And then, the whispers began. The landlord paced his office, his fingers tapping impatiently on the wooden desk. It had been a week since he had thrown that family out. He didn't regret his decision, not at all. Business was business. If they couldn't pay, they didn't deserve to stay. Yet, something bothered him. The apartment, it remained empty. That wasn't supposed to happen. The location was prime real estate, and he had expected new tenants to move in immediately. In fact, he had already listed it at a higher rent, confident that eager renters would flood in. But every single one of them walked away. Some said the place felt off. Others didn't give an explanation. A few even looked nervous after stepping inside, as if they had felt something unnatural. Superstitious nonsense, he muttered to himself. His phone buzzed. It was the building manager. "Sir," the man hesitated. "We need to talk." "About apartment 406. "What about it?" the landlord asked, already irritated. "There's something weird going on." The landlord clenched his jaw. "Weird how?" "Tenants keep complaining. Even the ones in the surrounding units. They're saying they hear things. Voices. Footsteps in the middle of the night." The landlord exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "The apartment is empty." "I know. But I checked the security footage." The way the man's voice wavered made the landlord uneasy. "What did you see?" A long pause. "I think you need to see it for yourself." That evening, the landlord arrived at the building, brushing off the cold sweat forming on his back. He wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. He was a man of facts, logic, and profit. He entered the dimly lit security room, where the manager sat in front of a monitor full of paused footage. "Show me," the landlord ordered. The manager hesitated before pressing play. The black and white recording flickered, showing the empty hallway outside apartment 406. The timestamp was from 3 nights ago, around 2:37 a.m. The landlord squinted. At first, there was nothing. Then, suddenly, the door to the apartment creaked open, by itself. A shiver ran down his spine. He leaned in closer, watching as the door slowly swung open into the darkness of the vacant apartment. "Must be a draft," he muttered. The manager didn't say a word. He simply fast-forwarded the footage to another timestamp, 4:02 a.m. The landlord's breath caught. The door was still open, but this time, there was something standing in the doorway. A shadowy figure. Not solid, but not quite mist either. A dark silhouette, just standing there, motionless. No face. No features. Just a shape. The landlord felt a strange tightness in his chest. Could be a camera glitch. The manager didn't look convinced. "Keep watching." The footage continued. The figure didn't move for nearly a full minute, then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. Not walked away. Not faded. Just blinked out of existence. The landlord felt a chill crawl up his spine. Check the door logs. Did anyone enter the apartment that night? "I already did," the manager said, his voice quiet. No one did. The landlord swallowed. He didn't believe in ghosts, but this didn't make sense. "I'll check the place myself," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. The manager's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" The landlord gave a stiff nod. He wasn't about to let some flickering shadows on a screen scare him off. He grabbed the spare key and made his way to the 4th floor. Apartment 406 stood at the end of the hall. The air felt colder near the door, but he shook it off. He wasn't some fool who jumped at shadows. With a firm grip, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was silent. Empty. Normal. He stepped inside, his shoes echoing slightly against the bare floors. Everything looked exactly the way it should. The only thing left from the previous tenants was a forgotten child's toy, a small, stuffed rabbit sitting in the corner. He frowned. Hadn't the family taken all their things? Annoyed at himself for even caring, he bent down and grabbed the toy. As soon as his fingers brushed against it, a loud bang sounded from the hallway. The landlord spun around, heart hammering. The door had slammed shut. His breath came fast. He tried to convince himself it was the wind. The building's ventilation. Something logical. Then, in the heavy silence, he heard it. A whisper. Faint. Childlike. "You shouldn't have done that." His blood ran ice cold. The landlord turned sharply, but the room was empty. Another whisper. Closer. "You shouldn't have done that." His hands trembled. He rushed to the door, gripping the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at his throat. He banged on the wood, demanding, "Open this door." Silence. Then, suddenly, a shadow flickered across the room. Not from outside. Not from the hallway. It was inside with him. The landlord's breath hitched as the whispers grew louder, layering over each other, an eerie chorus. "You shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have done that." The stuffed rabbit slid across the floor on its own. The landlord's pulse pounded in his ears. Then, just as suddenly as it started, silence. The door creaked open by itself. The landlord stumbled out, gasping for breath. He didn't look back. As he reached the stairwell, something made him freeze. From inside the apartment, sitting on the empty floor, the stuffed rabbit tilted slightly to the side, as if something invisible had just picked it up. The landlord leaned back in his expensive leather chair, sipping his whiskey as he reviewed his growing empire. The eviction had been just another day in business. People came and went, why should he care? Yet, a strange unease settled in his chest, a feeling he couldn't shake. It had started small. At first, he chalked it up to exhaustion. The stress of demolishing the old apartment building and preparing the new luxury complex had kept him busy. But then, things became unsettling. Late at night, while reviewing contracts in his penthouse, he noticed shadows shifting in the corner of his eye. Every time he turned, nothing was there. The power flickered, though the electrician swore the wiring was perfect. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, a murmur, like a conversation happening just beyond his reach. But soon, they grew louder. One night, as he poured himself another drink, his blood ran cold. "You will regret this." The word slithered through the silence, spoken so close to his ear that he felt the breath of it on his neck. He spun around. No one was there. He slammed the glass onto the counter. It was his imagination. Stress, that was all. But deep down, something inside him stirred, an old, forgotten instinct telling him to run. He refused to listen. The nightmare begins the next morning. His phone buzzed with urgent messages. His bank accounts were acting strange. His company accountant stammered over the phone. "Sir, there's been an issue. Some of your accounts are missing funds." "Missing?" the landlord snapped, gripping his phone. "How much?" "Millions, sir. It's like the transactions never existed." The landlord's stomach dropped. This wasn't possible. He had the best financial security, the top lawyers, the most powerful banks at his side. Money didn't just vanish. And yet, it had. He drove to his office, trying to suppress the growing dread. But when he arrived, his secretary met him with a pale face. "Sir, your investors are pulling out." His breath caught. "What? Which ones?" "All of them." He stormed into his office and dialed the first investor. The call went straight to voicemail. The next one too. And the next. One by one, they had all disappeared. It made no sense. Just days ago, he had been on top of the world. What was happening? Then, his office lights flickered again. And in the reflection of his window, he saw them. The evicted family. Standing. Watching. His breath hitched. He spun around, but the room was empty. The fear takes hold that night. He refused to sleep. He sat in his study, lights on, his whiskey untouched. And then, the scratching began. At first, it was soft. Like a mouse in the walls. Then it grew louder. Something was inside his house. His heart pounded as he followed the sound to the hallway. His fingers trembled as he reached for the door handle. Slowly, he pushed it open. Darkness. But then, a shadow moved. It darted across the hall, too fast, too unnatural. He slammed the door shut, his breathing ragged. He was losing his mind. That's all. This wasn't real. But deep down, he knew. Something was here. No escape. The next day, he called his investigator. "I need you to find that family," he ordered. "The ones I evicted. I don't care what it costs." The investigator hesitated. "Sir, there's no record of them." The landlord's skin crawled. "What do you mean?" "No ID, no paperwork. No one by that description ever rented from you." His breath hitched. That was impossible. He saw them. He threw them out himself. But... The investigator paused. "There is something strange about that land. I need more time." The landlord ended the call, his hands clammy. Something wasn't right. That night, he bolted his doors, locked his windows, and kept every light on. But when he woke up, his front door was wide open. And in the distance, beyond the doorway, he saw the family. Standing in the dark. Waiting. And then, they started walking toward him. The landlord sat in his office, tapping his fingers against the mahogany desk. The room was dimly lit, the glow from his expensive lamp casting long shadows across the walls. He hadn't slept properly in days. The strange occurrences were no longer small inconveniences. They had become undeniable. The security guards reported seeing figures moving in the hallways late at night, only for the footage to show nothing. Doors opened and closed on their own, even when locked. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped in certain areas of the building, even though there were no electrical issues. But the worst part, the part he refused to admit to himself, was the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable. But now, they were everywhere. They came from the vents, the walls, the pipes. They spoke in low, urgent tones, voices overlapping, never quite clear, but always present. And tonight, as he sat in his office, the whispers were louder than ever. Something was terribly wrong. He pulled out a thick file from his drawer. He had hired a private investigator to dig into the history of that family. Not because he cared about them, but because he wanted answers. He flipped through the papers. Nothing unusual. Just an ordinary couple with a child. The father worked a normal job, the mother stayed at home. No criminal record. No debts beyond the rent they owed him. Then why was this happening? A sharp knock on the door made him jump. He hadn't called for anyone. His pulse pounded as he got up and swung open the door. A man in a dark coat stood there, rain dripping from his hat. His face was aged, worn by time and knowledge. His eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp. "Who the hell are you?" the landlord snapped. The man stepped inside without permission, his gaze sweeping the room as if searching for something. His presence sent an unexplainable chill down the landlord's spine. "You've made a mistake," the man said finally, his voice deep and calm. The landlord narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" The man turned, locking eyes with him. "The family you threw out, they weren't ordinary." Something in his tone made the landlord's stomach twist. He let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, please. What, they're cursed. They're ghosts now. Give me a break." The man remained still. "Not ghosts. Not yet." He walked past the landlord and stopped near the window, looking out at the stormy night. "But you don't understand what you've done. You didn't just take their home, you took their protection." The landlord frowned. "What are you talking about?" The man turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "Do you know why no one wanted that apartment before they moved in?" A cold shiver ran down the landlord's back. He hadn't thought about it before, but now that he did, he remembered. That unit had been vacant for years. Tenants always left within weeks, claiming they felt unsafe. Strange noises, bad dreams, unexplained paranoia. Some even reported waking up outside their own apartments, as if something had physically removed them. Then, that family moved in. And for the first time in years, nothing happened. No complaints. No mysterious disturbances. Silence. The landlord swallowed hard. The man in the coat stepped closer. They weren't just tenants. They were the reason this building remained standing. The landlord clenched his fists. "You're insane." The man's gaze darkened. "No. I'm the only one who can help you. But time is running out." At that moment, the lights cut out completely. And the whispers turned into screams. The landlord gripped his steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His car sat idling in the parking lot, but he couldn't bring himself to shift it into gear. His breath was uneven, his heart still racing from what had happened inside apartment 406. That thing, the whispers, the shadows, the way the stuffed rabbit moved as if touched by unseen hands, none of it made sense. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a bad tenant experience. This was something else. Something wrong. With a frustrated groan, he slammed his fist against the dashboard. No. He refused to believe in superstitions. There had to be an explanation, a trick of the mind, stress, exhaustion, maybe even a prank. That was it. Someone was playing games with him. He exhaled, trying to steady himself. Tomorrow, he'd get a contractor to inspect the apartment. Check the wiring, check for carbon monoxide leaks, check everything. He'd prove to himself that there was nothing unusual about that place. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine wouldn't start. The landlord frowned. He tried again. Nothing. He muttered a curse under his breath. The car had been perfectly fine earlier. Why now? He turned the key again. This time, something flashed on the dashboard screen. The radio, which had been completely off, suddenly came to life. A burst of static filled the car, loud and jarring. Then, beneath the static, he heard it. A voice. Faint. Distant. Childlike. You shouldn't have done that. His breath caught in his throat. The screen flickered. The lights on the dashboard dimmed and brightened rapidly. Then, the engine roared to life, on its own. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as if someone had slammed their foot on the gas. But his foot wasn't even on the pedal. Panic shot through him as he gripped the wheel, trying to slam on the brakes, but they weren't responding. The car was driving itself. It veered toward the exit of the parking lot, picking up speed. No, 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 he shouted, struggling for control. Just as suddenly as it had started, the car jerked to a stop, throwing him forward against his seatbelt. Silence. The engine was dead again. The landlord sat there, panting, sweat beading on his forehead. His fingers trembled as he reached for the door handle, his only thought now to get out of the car and away from this place. He shoved the door open, stumbled onto the pavement, and leaned against the vehicle, gasping for breath. The night was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The streetlights around the parking lot flickered, casting long shadows across the ground. Then, he heard it. A soft laugh. Not from inside the car. Not from the building. From right behind him. His entire body froze. He didn't want to turn around. But some horrible, invisible force made him. Slowly, he turned his head. And saw nothing. Only the dark, empty parking lot. His chest rose and fell in uneven gasps. Then, out of the corner of his eye, a shadow moved. Not a normal shadow. Not cast by a person or object. It moved on its own. It crawled across the pavement toward him, twisting and bending in ways that weren't natural. The landlord ran. He didn't stop. Didn't think. Didn't look back. He sprinted across the street, his mind screaming at him to just get away. By the time he reached his personal townhouse several blocks away, his legs burned, his lungs ached, and his heart felt like it might explode. But he had made it. He slammed the door shut behind him and locked every bolt, gasping for air. Safe. He was safe. Or so he thought. Because when he turned to face his dark living room, there it was. The stuffed rabbit. Sitting on his coffee table. Staring at him. The landlord's vision blurred. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. His breath hitched, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Then, a whisper. This time, right next to his ear. You can't run from this. The landlord collapsed to his knees, trembling. For the first time in his life, he knew, this wasn't something he could fight. This wasn't something he could just buy his way out of. Something had followed him. And it wasn't going to stop. The landlord had lost everything. His wealth, his business, his reputation, it had all crumbled like sand slipping through his fingers. The once powerful man now stood alone in his mansion, staring at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow. He barely recognized himself. The voices hadn't stopped. The shadows never left. Every night, they grew bolder. Every night, they inched closer. He had tried to run. 2 nights ago, he packed his bags and drove as far as the highway would take him. He didn't care where he went, he just needed to get away. But no matter how far he drove, the road always led him back. Back to the ruins of his demolished building. Back to the land where it all began. It didn't matter which direction he took. He could drive for hours, but the moment he blinked, he'd be here again. The city turns against him. Desperation clawed at his mind. He tried to call for help. His lawyer refused to answer. His assistant had vanished. His phone barely worked, the screen glitched, the numbers distorted. Every time he tried dialing a friend, the call went to static. And then, a voice would whisper through the receiver, "You shouldn't have done it." The next morning, he staggered through the city, looking for anyone familiar. But as he passed by people on the streets, something horrifying happened. No one acknowledged him. It was as if he didn't exist. He waved his hands in front of a woman, she walked right through him. He shouted at a man in a suit, the man didn't even flinch. His breath turned shallow. His hands trembled. Was he dead? No. That was impossible. He was still here. He could still feel, still breathe. But something had changed. He was trapped between worlds. No doors left to open. The city was rejecting him, and he had nowhere left to go. With shaking steps, he returned to his mansion, though it no longer felt like home. The second he stepped inside, the doors slammed shut behind him. And the temperature dropped. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Silence. He swallowed hard, gripping the edge of a table for support. Then, from the darkness, a whisper. "You are not supposed to be here." His blood turned to ice. The voice was right behind him. He turned, and there they stood. The family. Their expressions blank. Their eyes dark, endless voids. They weren't human anymore. They never were. "You took our home," the mother's voice rang, though her lips never moved. "You took everything," the father added. The child, the same child he had seen crying on the street, stared at him with an eerie stillness. "Now we take you." A reality that no longer exists. The walls of the mansion warped and twisted. The expensive furniture dissolved into dust. The chandelier above cracked, its crystals falling like shards of ice. The world was shifting. No, not the world. His world. Something pulled at him, dragging him into the floor. The shadows wrapped around his arms, his legs, pulling him deeper, suffocating him. And then, everything stopped. Silence. Darkness. And when he opened his eyes, he was back at the ruins of the demolished building. The city was gone. His mansion no longer existed. And standing before him, waiting in the dim light, was the mysterious figure. It wasn't the family this time. It was something far older, far greater. A being that had existed long before him. "You should not have come here," it murmured, its voice neither kind nor cruel. "But now that you have, you must make a choice." The landlord sat in his dimly lit office, his fingers trembling as he poured himself another glass of whiskey. The ice clinked against the sides, but his mind was elsewhere. The whispers had become voices. The shadows in the hallway had become figures. The scratches on the walls had turned into full sentences. And now, after what he had just discovered about the family, he knew why. The investigator's report lay open on his desk, the words burned into his mind. The father of the evicted family was not an ordinary man. There were no official records of his birth. No employment history beyond a certain point. No medical records. No trace of where he had come from before moving into the apartment. The mother, too, had anomalies in her history. And the child? He wasn't even listed in any government database. They weren't just an unlucky family that had fallen behind on rent. They were something else. A barrier of some kind. A protector against something much, much worse. And by throwing them out, he had unleashed it. The landlord's breath came in short gasps as he leaned back in his chair. His building was falling apart, tenants had fled, his businesses were crumbling, and now he was completely alone. A sudden knock at the door made him flinch. Not again. He hesitated before standing up, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him not to open it. But the knocking continued, louder. Gritting his teeth, he reached for the doorknob and pulled it open. No one was there. The hallway was dark, stretching endlessly in both directions. But something was different. A figure stood at the far end, barely visible under the flickering lights. The landlord's blood turned to ice. It was the father. The man he had thrown out into the rain that night. But he wasn't human anymore. His presence sent an unnatural pressure through the air. His eyes weren't normal, they glowed faintly in the darkness. His stance was unnatural, as if he wasn't walking but hovering just slightly above the floor. The landlord wanted to speak, to beg, to apologize, to do anything to make this stop. But his throat locked up. He couldn't move. The figure took a single step forward. And in a voice that wasn't entirely his own, he finally spoke. "You should have left us alone." The lights went out completely. The landlord screamed. The landlord sat in his car, staring at the crumpled eviction notice in his trembling hands. His once steady fingers, the same ones that had signed countless eviction orders without hesitation, now shook with uncertainty. He had spent his entire life believing that money equaled power, that he was untouchable. But now, something far greater than him had taken control. The shadows in his home, the whispers in his ears, the stuffed rabbit that kept reappearing no matter how many times he tried to get rid of it, they were not coincidences. They were a warning. And he knew exactly who he had to face. It took hours to track them down, but he finally stood outside the rundown apartment where the evicted family had been forced to move. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. He had spent years ruining lives for profit, yet for the first time, he felt like a beggar at someone else's door. His knuckles rapped against the old wood, the sound feeling pathetic in the quiet night air. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Footsteps. The door cracked open just enough for him to see a pair of exhausted eyes staring back at him. The mother. The landlord swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I need to talk to you." Silence. Then, the door creaked open further. He stepped inside, the room bare, almost lifeless. A small mattress in the corner, a few belongings stacked against the wall. The air felt heavy, like sorrow itself had settled in. And yet, something else lingered here. A presence. Something watching. The landlord exhaled sharply, trying to find his voice. "Something's happening to me." To the apartment. The woman's face didn't change. She just stared at him, her gaze unreadable. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath his fear. "I need to know, what did you leave behind?" "What did I?" The woman lifted a hand, stopping him. "You don't understand," she said quietly. The landlord's mouth went dry. "Then help me understand." She hesitated, then walked toward a small wooden box on the table. She lifted the lid, revealing an old photograph. He stepped closer, his pulse pounding. His breath hitched. It was a photo of the child he had evicted. The same child whose eyes haunted him every night. But something was wrong. The photo was faded, old, too old. The edges were frayed, the colors washed out, as if it had been taken years ago. He stared at it, then at her, confusion twisting inside him. I don't understand. I saw him. The boy. The day I evicted you. The mother slowly shook her head. Her voice was barely a whisper. That's not possible. The room seemed to shrink around him. His pulse pounded. What do you mean? I saw him. He was there. A single tear slipped down her cheek. He's been gone for 5 years. The landlord staggered back as if struck. His head spun, his breath coming fast and uneven. No, he refused to believe it. He had seen the boy with his own eyes. Hadn't he? He gripped the edge of the table, his vision blurring. Then who? The woman's lips trembled. You didn't evict us. You evicted him. The landlord's stomach plummeted. The child hadn't been real. The child had never left. His ears rang as the realization hit him like a freight train. The thing in that apartment wasn't just some lingering presence. It was him. For the first time in his life, the landlord felt completely powerless. He turned back to the woman. Please. Tell me how to stop this. The woman exhaled shakily. It's too late for an easy fix. The landlord's chest tightened. Then what do I do? She looked at him, her sorrow shifting into something colder. You have to give something back. His hands curled into fists. What does that mean? The woman's voice was steady now. A life was taken. The apartment will not rest until it has been repaid. His blood ran ice cold. You mean? Her lips parted, but before she could speak, the lights flickered. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The landlord's breath hitched. Something was here. The woman's eyes widened, and she stepped back, her fingers clutching the photo. A whisper filled the air. Soft. Childlike. Echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. You shouldn't have done that. The landlord stumbled back, his legs hitting the chair behind him. His pulse pounded in his ears. The apartment wanted payment. And if he didn't give it what it wanted, it would take it. The landlord stood frozen, staring at the figure before him. The city was gone. His mansion, his wealth, everything had been erased. He was nowhere and everywhere at once. The being in front of him wasn't human. It wasn't a ghost. It was something else entirely. Something ancient. Something that had watched for centuries as men like him destroyed, took, and consumed without thought. You were given a home, yet you took others away. The voice echoed all around him, as if the land itself was speaking. You believed wealth could shield you, the voice continued, but there are things that no amount of power can protect against. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. His voice was gone. You were warned. The figure stepped closer. The ground beneath the landlord's feet began to crack. He was sinking. Memories flooded his mind. The eviction. The cruel smirk on his face as he tossed their belongings into the street. The father's last words, one day, you'll regret this more than anything in your life. And he did. Oh, how he did. He wanted to take it back. But time had no mercy. A chance at redemption? Please. He gasped, his voice returning just in time for him to plead. Tell me how to fix this. The figure studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, it spoke, you cannot undo what has been done. But you can choose how this ends. The ground stopped crumbling. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he saw something in the figure's presence, a sliver of mercy. You may suffer as those you have wronged, it said, or you may spend the rest of your days making amends. The landlord barely breathed. How? The world around him began to shift. The ruins of his demolished building reappeared. But this time, something was different. It was whole again. The apartment was rebuilt, restored, alive. And then, he saw them. The family. Standing at the doorstep. Waiting. The final test. He hesitated. Every part of him wanted to run. To pretend this had never happened. But another part of him, the part that had been stripped of greed, of arrogance, knew what had to be done. His knees hit the ground. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I was wrong." The father stepped forward, studying him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the air shifted. The darkness lifted. And the family disappeared. They were free. And the landlord? The mansion never returned. His wealth never came back. But the land remained. And he stayed. For the rest of his life, he dedicated himself to rebuilding, to helping others, to making amends for the damage he had caused. And though the whispers faded, he never forgot them. Some mistakes cannot be undone. Some debts cannot be paid in money. And some lessons come too late.